Today, I'd like to talk about stories. And for those of you focused on management reporting, advanced analytics, or responding to a mandate from your CEO to be more data-driven, this presentation is for you. Now, let me warn you, this won't be the same tired message about storytelling that you've heard before. I'm going to debunk some of the things you think make for good storytelling. The reason is, most of us do the majority of our reporting and thus storytelling in a very different environment than before. In a digital world, we've run into a new paradox. This question of how do you tell a story when you're not there to tell it? Our ways of working are changing. Self-service tools, remote access, AI, and our storytelling needs to evolve as well. Let's briefly take a look at this concept of stories, and specifically data stories told in a digital world. Most of you are probably familiar with the idea that all stories fall into one of a few structures. Here are a couple of famous formulas for good storytelling. The first, a hero's journey. Luke, a young farmer, dreams of leaving home, but lacks a way to do so. And then he meets Obi-Wan Kenobi, who gives him a lightsaber, Jedi training, and a message from a princess. And that calls Luke to save the princess. And the training he receives helps him to avoid missing his shot that ultimately destroys the Death Star and saves the galaxy. Similarly, Pixar uses this formula every time they write a movie. Finding Nemo, The Incredibles, Toy Story, Monsters, Inc., they all follow this storytelling formula. And that's because stories are universal. They're how our brains are programmed to receive and store information. Now, you've probably heard the old saying that people remember stories, not facts. And there's a lot of established science behind the power of stories. The data you see up here is from London Business School, which found that 5 to 10% of an audience will remember a statistic. Include a visual, and chances go up to 25%. In fact, humans process visuals 60,000 times faster than text. But add a story to wrap it all together, and now it's 65 to 75%. And this was confirmed by similar studies at Duke and Stanford. The work of cognitive psychologist Jerome Bruner suggests that even more power behind stories. His numbers showed you're 22 times more likely to remember a fact if it's wrapped up in a story. And if you don't remember those numbers, don't worry, I just spent 30 seconds telling you wouldn't anyway. But here's the interesting insight that I think you might remember. A neuroscientist named Paul Zak uncovered that stories trigger the release of oxytocin in the brain, which creates empathy in the receiver of the story. Sort of a chemical explanation behind what he calls the trust hormone. And that release of hormone is what triggers the retention of information. Amazing. So if you find your business leaders are skeptical of your data, your insights, or you have to repeat yourself, you might not be telling enough stories. And in a business sense, it's really important that business leaders retain financial information. We know that when leaders don't retain information, they act on their gut, leading to unsound decisions. That equals a loss of 3% EBITDA per our research, and in some cases, the loss was up to 8%. And this will only get harder as your team upskills on AI and the explanation for data insights becomes even more technically complex. Good storytelling will be even more imperative. But before I get long-winded on stories and how great they are, here's the problem we run into today. Everything we've been taught about storytelling has assumed a linear structure to the story, point by point along a plot line. The hero's journey and your last board presentation, both linear stories, perhaps of varying entertainment values. So then, what do you do when you use a self-service platform to share data, and the platform isn't linear? You're not even in the room to give the linear presentation. Well, I'm going to give you the answer to that. We'll dive into the mistakes we're currently making and take a look at where you can go to find ways to structure our new digital stories. And then I want to give you a few practical places to get started at the end. Let's start by taking a look at the kind of stories you tell when you're in the room, and we'll have a little fun with it. What you're seeing here is called Freytag's pyramid, and it's considered one of the gold standards for good analytic storytelling. It's broken into 5 plot sections: exposition, that's the background details and context; arising action, this is where the analyst tells the listener the trends and events that leads to a climax. This is usually the key finding of our analysis, which is then followed by debate and discussion of possible consequences, which ultimately leads to a decision point. Now let's imagine the writers at Pixar woke up one day and decided to write a finance story. Here's how that might look. Once upon a time, our revenue grew steadily. Every day, our sales and retention slowly improved, until one day, macroeconomic factors changed. Because of that, client engagement shifted to new services. And now, our product mix is poorly aligned, which has meant that our product development and branding efforts are seeing low ROI. And until we fix our product mix strategy, our financials and EPS will suffer. In a traditional PowerPoint or PDF report, this story would be easy enough to structure page by page. But let's take a look at our digital storytelling in self-service reports and dashboards and their underlying structure. What I have up on the slide is a fairly good first tab of a self-service dashboard. Do your dashboards look like this? If not, then come find me after the session or set up time and we can talk about how to get more out of information. We've got our main KPIs at the top highlighting key performance. We've got some nice trending charts in the middle to help us contextualize those numbers. And we've got a few supporting details that we know are of interest to our audience. When we look beyond the first tab, our whole workbook structure looks a little bit like this in abstract. The landing page has our primary KPIs. That's what we just saw. If we then click into revenue, for example, we might see a similarly designed page that includes data on new business, retention, and product mix. And behind that, there are maybe pages where a user could dig further into the specifics behind sales, account management, or product performance. So here we map out the plot points of the story that the team at Pixar came up with onto our dashboard structure. So first, we'd land on the home page and assess that our revenue had started to fall relative to historical trends. So we dig in to see what was going on and probably investigate retention, performance, and new business. We might investigate macroeconomic factors until we notice that engagement has shifted drastically. And that would hopefully prompt us to go over to our product mix figures to see what was going on there. And maybe we'd ultimately tie that back to EPS. Now, if you're a little skeptical that anyone would ever put together that little whirlwind journey, you should be. On a dashboard, our little story is 5 lucky clicks. Imagine the damage I could do as a decision maker if I had chosen to dig into marketing efforts instead of channel engagement. I'd be at finance's door asking for millions of dollars to advertise to new markets and then ignoring the phone calls and pulling the curtains closed when finance came to look at the ROI. And here's the inherent problem. We're trying to tell linear stories in a nonlinear platform. The reality is we need to get good at a very different style of storytelling. Choose your own adventure. Oh yes. Remember those gems from the 80s and 90s? And don't worry, I won't ask you to raise your hands to see who remembers, because at this point I think the 80s are long ago than most of us would care to think about. But Choose Your Own Adventure stories started in 1976 when an author named Ed Packard approached a publisher that was known for their innovative role-playing games for children. The publisher quickly realized that Packard had created a one-person role-playing game in book form and enthusiastically published it. So Choose Your Own Adventure has roots in game theory, of all things, as well as role-playing simulations like Dungeons and Dragons. So take a look at this map and tell me this doesn't feel like a more accurate representation of the way your colleagues might navigate through a self-service workbook. This map is from Choose Company, that's the publishing company I mentioned, and it maps out all the possible story arcs and plot points in their second published work, Journey Under the Sea. It's from the work of authors in this field, from this type of storytelling, that we need to be drawing our inspiration for storytelling in a digital world. So let's take a look then at what we can learn from these authors and apply it with some scientific rigor to business and finance. I spent some time looking at the authors' blogs and writing guides for Choose Your Own Adventure stories. For any AI enthusiasts here, I discovered that Choose Your Own Adventure stories are, in mathematical terms, a form of directed root tree. And everywhere I looked, there were two essential steps to writing a good Choose Your Own Adventure story. First, you need to structure your narrative clusters. In stories, the plot connects the characters in a narrative cluster. If our story is set in space, and our hero is on planet X, then our hero can't suddenly end up on planet Y without explanation. And second, we need to design narrative chains. The most common advice here from the Choose Your Own Adventure authors were, take it easy on the deaths, which thankfully we don't need to worry about in finance. But we do need to avoid finishing our data stories abruptly or letting them run on too long. We need to guide our readers down a path that leads to an intuitive conclusion. So in more business language, if we want to tell good stories, we need to structure data relationships and design data story plot lines that make sense to our readers. And that will require us to grow two new competencies with our analysts in finance: graph analytics and decision intelligence. For those of you wondering, what does the future of good management reporting or analytical storytelling look like? It's these two areas. Unfortunately, just because we made management reporting self-service doesn't mean we don't have to think about it anymore. Graph analytics, for those unfamiliar, is the study of relationships between objects, the things we measure with data. It's a set of analytic techniques that shows how things such as people, places, and things are related to each other. Graph is usually deployed to forecast behavior and prescribe action for dynamic groups. Decision intelligence, on the other hand, is the multidisciplinary study of how humans make decisions and what we can do to improve decision-making. Graph reveals the relevant context. It reveals the narrative clusters of data points and the relationships between them. And decision intelligence is how we start to better understand the intuition of our readers. Answering questions like, when they see a data point, what do they expect to see next? If you're someone whose team has a self-service tool implemented and you're trying to get your team into predictive analytics, focus on graph analytics. That's your gateway to predictive analytics. If your team is a little more advanced, working on machine learning perhaps, then focus on decision intelligence. Let's start with graph, the more foundational of the two, though it's very different to the analytics you're used to. Graph is fluid and flexible in how it interprets data because the relationships between items don't rely on keys. So it doesn't force us to fit data into rows and columns, nor does it force us to oversimplify problems by establishing lists of dependent and independent variables and ignoring everything else. That means we can analyze more complex systems where lots of variables are all interacting, a bit like how modern businesses really work. So remember this, in traditional tables, the value is in the facts of the data points, but graph is about the relationships between those data points. But what does this have to do with storytelling? Well, it gives us new insights, but also it helps us analyze the business context for data. Every story needs context. Star Wars famously starts with context. A long time ago, in a galaxy far, far away. That's context. In the finance galaxy, context is the question of why does this data matter to me? Or more specifically, what does this data have, what relationship does it have to the financial outcome that I care about? Insight comes when we understand that the relationship between non-financial data and financial outcomes is really what we're seeking. It tells us what's relevant and what's extraneous or perhaps even misleading. In the world of drama and writing, there's a principle called Chekhov's gun. You may have heard of it. But if you haven't, Anton Chekhov was a successful Russian playwright whose most famous advice for young playwrights was, if in Act 1 you have a pistol hanging on the wall, then it must fire by the last act. Otherwise, don't put it there. The point was, no extraneous details. The existence of the pistol and its location on the wall and what it might do, these are all contextual data points that we could analyze with graph. Now, an interesting twist. The great Ernest Hemingway famously despised this principle of writing. He even wrote about it in a book. However, he did admit that it's human nature to seek symbolism in unfired pistols. Well, in finance, that human nature to look for a relationship between data points is one of the largest risks in self-service reporting. What bad conclusions will your business leaders make big bets on? But speaking of dangers and risks, the James Bond film series is a great example of Chekhov's principle. There's always some gadget, a pen that's actually a camera or something, that's introduced in Act 1, and it's always used later in the story. Any James Bond fans out there? Maybe we'll take show of hands. Yeah, excellent. So I thought, what better example of the power of graph analytics can I give than the one from the company that makes the preferred vehicle of James Bond villains? They even had a great ad campaign about it, and that is Jaguar Land Rover. So at Jaguar Land Rover, they faced a problem where each of the business units spoke a different language. Sound familiar? Storytelling is hard, but it's a lot harder in a language you don't speak. Supply chain, sales, and engineering, they all talked about different parts of the value chain. That's how most businesses are organized. And so we develop our own languages for data. That made it hard for finance to forecast profitability. At JLR, customers can request different features for custom-built cars, meaning there are millions of permutations of their products. So average cost and margin estimates aren't very useful for forecasting. What JLR realized is that a car is actually simply a set of connected features, and a feature is a set of connected parts. There's a relationship that connects these data points across our data silos. That means we can start to group our data points based on their relationships to form our narrative clusters, and we can start to explain how the players in our story know each other. Are these data sets sworn enemies, or perhaps best friends heading out on an epic adventure? When we understand these relationships, we can now start to tackle the problem of what really matters to us. What do we need to emphasize in our digital story, and what do we need to bury? For example, we can evaluate the volumes, pricing, and profitability of the features built up from the orders and analysis of assembly parts and supply and labor cost. We're joining two worlds here. The product executive mostly wants to look at volumes, pricing, and profitability. The head of manufacturing also cares about profitability, but is focused on the operations within their control. We would never expect either executive to sift through data or make the connections themselves. We need to guide them to the information they need for their decision. And while the mix of features is important to both of them, it matters for different reasons. And so to get to the real decision-relevant data, we need to provide some detail on features. What graph analytics does for us in storytelling is that it tells us what to promote and what to elevate in self-service dashboards. It tells us which details are impactful to the story and which details are pistols that should fire and which ones we're worried our users might fire for us. So the next time you're looking at your self-service dashboard and thinking, is this setting up the dashboard user for getting an answer to their business problem? Think graph. Now that we have context for our story, we have to solve for the other part of our problem, our audience. Every audience has an intuition that they bring to a story. We often call intuition a gut feeling, but that's actually misleading. Intuition is the result of deeply held logical models in our brain that are shaped by culture and experience. Think of intuition as the operating system of a person's brain. If you ever found yourself rejecting the end of a story because the princess ended up with the wrong prince, that's your intuition at work. So if we're going to appeal to our audience, we need to understand the logical model that underpins their intuition. It's another way of saying we need to understand how they see the world and how they make decisions, not how we do it in finance. And that's why decision in science or decision intelligence is fundamental. That's what it's about, right? That's why it's great. Using scientific processes to study the way that humans make decisions, and especially in an environment with AI, how to manage complex decision-making where some decisions are made by agents without human intuition. This field is new, but it's quickly gaining interest. So if you're looking to impress at cocktail parties, read up on this field. Okay, maybe your cocktail parties are more fun than mine. But fear not. There will be no more lessons on data structures. You've survived that part. Let's focus on how to get started that doesn't require any technology or technical skills. Decision mapping. Decision maps are visual representations of the various considerations and the order in which those considerations occur to the decision maker. So what you see up here are 3 simplified maps. Approach 1 is decision maker 1. Approach 2 is decision maker 2, and so on. In this example, a brave FP&A leader sat down with each of these business leaders and analyzed how they would evaluate a decision for switching suppliers. So business leader 1 looks at year-over-year spend alongside on-time delivery percentage and completeness. After evaluating those, the leader evaluates 5-year trends and expediting costs to better understand year-over-year. The orange boxes denote where each decision maker considers a unique data point in their decision. So if you're looking at this and saying, well, I can't map this out for every decision maker and make them each a custom dashboard, well, that's okay. In time, AI will do that for us. But for now, we only need a most representative map, where we create as close to a one-size-fits-all approach for our decision makers. Remember, the core value is that this closely approximates the intuition of your decision makers, which often, I'm afraid to say, accounting-driven data models do not. I have yet to meet a business leader that explains their decision-making by referencing general ledger account codes. So when we layer this back onto Graph, the one that we built, we need to have a path through those layers that makes sense to our business leaders. I know business leader X looks at car parts, then suppliers, and wants to see how that rolls up into car sales. And business leader Y might approach the same analysis from a different angle. And because I know my audience likes to consider 5-year trends in expediting costs, even though they shouldn't, I need to cut that out of the dashboard if my graph analytics tells me that it's not a meaningful relationship. Let me make sure we've really gotten that point. Designing a good digital story means taking away those data points that don't matter. Yes, we have to snatch away the comfort blanket of 5-year trends and expediting costs so we can get our readers to understand what really matters. I can also use visual markers and cues available to me to guide my readers down the right path so they can consider defect rates and on-time delivery, the things I want them looking at. And remember this bit of advice. People support what they help create. Just like we talked about with the release of oxytocin in the brain, ownership creates an emotional connection. So our best digital stories, if we want them to be accepted and understood and to drive behavior in our organizations, they have to be co-created with our users. So let me wrap up then with a few simple ideas to put these concepts into practice. I won't spend much time on these. We'll do this sort of like a lightning round. But please feel free to find me here at the conference or schedule time afterwards if you'd like to dive into any of these further. There are a few common monsters that we all face in this world of self-service reporting. For those of you who feel like you're drowning in data, I bet your readers do as well. A simple idea is to start using little watermarks to denote data quality in your dashboards. Don't go overboard here. We don't want too much visual clutter, but a few red flags or little markers can go a long way in educating your business leaders on what data caves have a dragon in them. If you're worried that your finance business partners aren't involved in decision-making anymore, and that may lead to improper use of data, I recommend using the semantic reporting capabilities of your self-service tool. Nearly all modern BI tools have an admin report that lays out which users are accessing which data sets and which calculations and definitions they're using. It's a little Orwellian Big Brother monitoring feature, but the way I like to think of it is like allowing cars to go off-roading. I just want a little GPS tracker to make sure you're not driving off a cliff with a homegrown definition of contribution margin. Some of you may be thinking more about the relationships between your financial and non-financial data and maybe want an elementary way of getting into graph analytics. These trap insights I refer to occur when finance delivers a purely financial account variance explanation of a business problem. We've all seen this before. A finance analyst proudly walks into a corner office and announces, "Miss Business Leader, I dug into the data and I figured out why you went over your budget last month. You spent too much on external contractors. Ta-da, analysis." Of course, the response is, "Yeah, I know, I'm signing the contracts." So if you want to avoid this mistake, do some regression analysis. If you've got a good list of KPIs, have a bright analyst that can use analytical software or languages like Alteryx or SPS, Python, or heck, even Excel can do this. Have them run a regression analysis to test the assumed relationships that your business leaders think exist. We can't prove causality with this alone, but we can eliminate bad metrics and KPIs. If there isn't a correlative relationship or a lagging correlation or some other type of correlation, then it's pretty hard to have a causal relationship, and we can clip those dead-end chains in our story. Now, some of you might just be getting into self-service reporting, or maybe you've seen your engagement and adoption with your dashboards fall short of expectations. If that's the case, rethink how you're orienting your reporting suite to your audience. Does the list of your various reports match how business leaders see the world? If a business leader needs to make a complex decision, how many dashboards do they need to pop between to make that decision? If the answer is more than one, then something's wrong. This is the most common mistake I see in all self-service implementations. We just take our old reporting suite and make a digital version of it, and we bring the sins of our past, those irrelevant details or unintuitive data structures, into a new environment where they continue to haunt us. And finally, classic one, we just use Power BI as an export to Excel. Now, if that's you, consider storyboarding your dashboards and doing some A/B testing, some comparisons. There's probably some sort of feature that's missing to make the dashboard useful on its own. And maybe that's an analysis that connects two plot points, or there's a missing set of data that needs to be considered and should be included on our decision maps. So a few recommendations on where to take this presentation. First, begin phasing graph analytics into your regular stable of analytics and talk to one of my finance IT colleagues on technology strategies to enable your team. Consider also doing a decision mapping experiment. Pick a decision you support with self-service tools and then talk to your Gartner account executive to get the guidance and templates that we have available to get started on decision mapping. And if you want further help, send in your dashboard to have either me or one of my colleagues give you some targeted ideas on how to evolve that report. And in closing, the key takeaways from today. Use graph to understand which details matter in your story and how they relate. Use decision maps to guide your readers down the right path. And remember, take it easy on the deaths. Thank you.